Welcome to Inside Economics. I'm Mark Sandy, the chief economist of Moody's Analytics, and I'm being joined by my two trusty co-hosts, Chris Dredes and Marisa DiNatale. Hi, guys.
Hey, Mark.
Good morning, Mark. Happy Friday.
Thank you so much. It's a nice Friday here in suburban Philly. But Chris, where are you? Are you still in Italy?
I'm in Italy at my mother-in-law's house.
Are you in Tuscany? Where are you exactly?
No, in Abruzzo, a little further south, and I guess would be east. Across from Rome is what we usually say, on the
Across
opposite
from,
coast.
oh yeah, right, across from Rome. And how are things there in Italy?
Going well. Yeah,
Yeah,
nice weather. Yeah,
nice weather.
can't complain. Yeah, I've been doing
Very
very
good.
important economic field research though, so I'm happy to, you know, give you a little insight into what's going on.
Yeah, well, fire away. What have you learned?
Tourism is strong. American tourism is, through the roof here. I've never seen it this strong. Asian tourism is down though, by my
Ah,
assessment here.
is that
Um,
because the dollar is strong and the yuan is cheap? Is that what's going on, or
that's my take. Is that it's
and the
currency
yen is
related.
on the floor, right?
It's not going anywhere. So
Right.
yeah, so I think just the economics are there. It's just a cheaper place to go for
So
Americans.
you see a lot of Americans milling about.
I did in the tourist spots. Now where I'm
Right.
now is like a remote village. There's nobody here, but
Managed to get away from them.
but in the hot spots, they're really hot. No slowdown.
That's good. That's
Uh,
very good. Well, I'm thinking about going to Tuscany in early November.
oh, it's a beautiful time of year.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you go hunting for truffles, apparently. Uh,
Is that your thing? I didn't
well,
know,
I now have a new son-in-law who's European. He's from Germany, and he's telling me about the truffle hunting in Tuscany in late October and early November. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, sounds right. But you have to have either a good dog or a good pig. Uh,
You don't
Yeah,
shoot them, Mark.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, hopefully he finds both. So I think we're going to do that, and hopefully the dollar remains strong against the euro
there you go. There
till
you
then,
go.
at least. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
And we have a guest, Jason Dorsey. Jason, good to see you and hear you.
Good to see you as well. Glad to be here. I'm already learning things, just joining right now. So thank you.
That's what we do on Inside Economics. We educate.
Yeah. I've got truffles, pigs, and dogs covered so far. So this is great. Heavy content.
And Jason and I met at I guess you'd call it a convention, the Consumer Bankers
Mhm.
Association. And do you remember that convention, Jason? Because I know you do a lot of speaking.
Oh yeah, that was a great one. It was in the DC area and had a huge audience, and it was fun. I got to follow you, which was fun because I don't hear many funny economists, and you were quite entertaining. Made fun of your own clothes, which was really
I,
strong, and you got to follow a regulator.
oh
I mean, it
yeah,
doesn't get better than that. Like this is really exciting. So yeah, it was a wonderful day. I enjoyed it.
that that's right. I spoke right after the director of CFPB, who uh, really brought the hammer down on the audience. I think wasn't he saying, and actually he's got a point. Like, although the folks in the Bankers Association didn't think so, that lending rates are awfully high. Like if you look at credit card interest rates, they're very, very high. Now they obviously have risen a lot because of what the Federal Reserve has done over the last couple of years. But even abstracting from that, the rates are high relative to any other interest rate, the federal funds rate or other interest rate. Is that right, Chris? Am I right about that? That the credit card rates are just unusually high. The spreads are awfully high relative to the risk-free rate.
I haven't looked recently, but I think that is the case, or at least it was not too long ago.
Yeah, Jason wasn't he hammering the group for that? I think he was. I think that was one of the many things he was hammering the group for.
Yeah, he had a lot of points that he was trying to make, I think, and I don't know the details of that. That's above my pay grade, but I know that he is definitely on a mission to try to create some change, and the industries are trying to figure out how to deal with that and navigate through it. So I
Right.
was really glad to follow him after following you.
Yeah.
So there was a nice buffer
All right.
before I went on, which I really appreciated. And at least for me, because I talk about generations and behavioral research, the CBA audience was all over it. Now maybe they were just excited for a different topic. I don't know, but they were definitely very excited during my talk. So you set me up, which I appreciate. So thank you for that.
Well, now that you mentioned it, I forgot completely about it. It was like you were supposed to wear jeans, right? Or something like that, I think.
Yeah, and you still showed up in I think khakis and a jacket. So you really represented well. It's good. It's a very strong statement.
Yeah,
you were on brand.
Well, this maybe goes to the generational thing. I'm definitely a boomer, but I don't think I own a pair of jeans.
What?
Right?
Stop the podcast.
No,
Okay.
come on.
That's generational.
No.
No, I don't think I own a pair of jeans. Maybe somewhere in my closet. I'll have to go dig. Take a
Please
look.
do and get back to
Yeah.
us.
Jason, do
There's
you own
so
jeans?
much to talk
You have
about.
You're
jeans?
saying boomers don't wear jeans? Is that?
Do boomers wear jeans? I don't know.
They do.
Zandy.
They do. They
They
do.
do
You're
wear
a
jeans?
special one. You're very special.
I'm a special
Yeah.
boomer.
Yeah, you're a khakis only kind of person. So yes, you
Were
were
you
on
wearing
brand. I'm
jeans?
telling you.
Were you wearing
I
jeans?
was wearing jeans. Yeah,
You were?
they said it
Oh.
was business casual. So yeah, I got the message.
Oh,
It's great.
okay.
It was great. But you looked very stylish in the khaki pants, which you then talked about. So it was great. It was good times.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And so Jason and I met at this convent. A conference doesn't seem to be the right word because it was massive. I mean, there were
Mhm.
a lot of people there. It felt like a
Mhm.
whole convention. And you gave a speech. You're the president of Generational Kinetic. Is it Generational Kinetics? Is that the way?
Yeah,
Is
it's
that
the
the
Center
way
for
to say it?
Generational Kinetics.
Center
Yeah,
for Generational
absolutely.
Kinetics.
Mhm.
Yeah. And you speak widely on issues with regard to how generations behave and kind of tie that back into, of course, for the folks at this conference or convention about banking issues, but more broadly about how people are spending their money across generations. That's sort of what your focus. I know I'm butchering this. Blame it on the COVID. I've got COVID
No
brain.
worries.
But do I have that roughly right?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, I mean, what we do is primary research to try to understand why different generations do the things they do or don't, right? How they view the world, why they're interacting in certain ways, different work styles, for example, in addition to things like spending, even attitudes towards credit cards, like what you've referred to a little bit. Like all of those tend to vary, sometimes dramatically by generation. And we try to figure out why that's going on. And, is it true? Because a lot of things that are said about generations are not true. And so being able to separate myth from truth, I think, is really valuable for leaders. And at least at that event, they're thinking about it through the lens of the banks that they lead, right? So not only on the lending side, but their team members, various generations of customers that they serve. And banks in particular, banking and finance is our largest industry, banking, healthcare, and technology. But banking is interesting because they serve pretty much every generation at the same time. And that puts them in a challenging situation because they tend to represent the generation they're in, much like you and your wonderful presentation with tons of PowerPoints and charts. It was amazing, like that sort of thing. And if you can help people create a little perspective around that with some healthy data, or at least just some stories that are grounded in data, it seems to create more trust and connection and influence, which is really what we try to help people do. So yeah, we think every generation is important.
And you have your own business, and I know you work with your wife. Can you just tell us a little bit about your story? How did you get to where you are and what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. The slightly extended version, which will make the rest make it more understandable, is I wrote my first book when I was 18, and I really wanted to help my generation and decided that was what I was going to do. So I dropped out of college as a junior and said, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to help, my generation, my people. And my parents basically disowned me, and I ended up sleeping on the floor for 2 years. And I borrowed money from everybody I could. I turned 19. I was $50,000 in debt, sleeping on the floor of a garage, like a tiny garage apartment. Had no furniture, no anything, just 5,000 books that I'd printed. And then a local newspaper wrote a story about me and said, this 18-year-old kid writes this book called Graduate to Your Perfect Job, hasn't graduated, doesn't have a job. And all of a sudden I started getting invited to speak. And then for whatever reason, people seemed to like it. And then they would buy the books and then they invite me to speak. And that book ended up becoming a big bestseller and ended up on the Today Show and The View and all these different TV shows. And then been on just over 200 television shows now, 60 Minutes, you name it. And then out of that, what sort of led to the research was I was speaking all over the world at arenas and executive retreats and board meetings and all this sort of stuff. And I ended up in DC, not far from where you and I spoke. And I was speaking to this big public company, to their board of directors, and they were just bashing millennials. And I'd been on 60 Minutes, and after the 60 Minutes segment, all these companies called, all these execs are like, your people, they're driving us crazy. Their pants are falling off. Their mom's here. They won't work on their birthday. Like, what is going on? Can you help? And so I showed up to start speaking to these companies. And this one in DC, it was for their board and some executives. And the CEO was just really bashing millennials. This was like peak, bash millennials time. And I didn't know any better, right? This was like 2006 or 7, somewhere in there, maybe 8. And I just asked him, I said, well, can I see your data? Like, what do I know? I'm still basically a kid, right? Can I see your data? Like, maybe it'll help me to understand what's going on. And so he sent me their data, or their team did. And I was back in the little condo where I lived, and my wife walks in, her name's Denise. She's like, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, I'm looking at this data. It doesn't make any sense. And she's like, well, why not? I said, well, the CEO told me that his millennial engineers are just not great. And yet the data from his own workforce system doesn't match what he said in front of the board of directors and all these executives. I was like, I don't know what to do about this. And Denise, my wife, has a PhD. She says, well, we should start a research firm, because if the CEO of the big fancy company can't read his own data, imagine if we gave him data he could actually use. And so that's how we started. Everybody thinks it's me because I'm on TV all the time, write all the books, but it actually was her idea, because she's a researcher by training. And so we started the firm initially just to do studies to separate myth from truth about generations, like what's really going on. But every time we would release a study, sort of like in your world, we get all this media coverage all the time, right? I had 3 media interviews this morning, requests. And so the more we did that, the more companies started hiring us and saying, hey, can you do our studies for us? Or can you figure out what's really going on with their customers? Sort of like what you talked about with CBA, or what's really going on. Do millennials actually want to buy houses, or is this some other thing? Because most of the data in the world, including in economics, which is sort of fun to get to hear Christian talk about this, most of the data in the world is what we consider tracking data. It's particularly true in economics, but it's true for most of our clients, right? They're tracking, does something go up, something go down, did it stay the same, did it start, did it stop? All really important things to know. Yeah, we make decisions based on this all the time. We run, AI models against it, all this stuff. But the challenge with tracking data, by definition, is, generally speaking, it's already happened. That's how it's tracked. And so it tells us a lot about what happened, but it doesn't tell us why. And so if we can do studies to figure out why people are doing things, or why they're thinking about the world in a certain way, then we can add some layers that don't normally show up. And that's what we're really good at. So for example, that people say all the time, younger generations don't want to buy houses. That's total nonsense. Every study we've ever led, they've said they wanted to buy houses, vast majority of them. But they just say they're not ready yet. They don't have the down payment. They can't afford the monthly payment. Like, they owe student loan. We come up with a whole bunch of things. But the headline thing says, look, millennials aren't buying houses, therefore the housing market's in trouble. And that's just not true. And so we try to challenge a lot of those myths that people run with, and bring some truth to it. So yeah, and it's fun. I get to speak every day all around the world.
That's a very cool story. I didn't realize that. Well, let me ask you this. It's always perplexed me. What defines a generation? I mean, we've got the boomers, we got Generation X, then we got the millennials, then Generation Z. I mean, how do these groups of people get kind of combined together? What defines a generation?
Yeah, so it's a really hot topic, a debate, but I'll give you my take on it, which is, historically, the way that we looked at generations was actually through death. And if you look at mortality rates, what people were looking at originally was how long were people living. They started tracking this. This was kind of interesting. Nobody tracked it before, but all of a sudden, a while back, people started looking at how long are you living and all this sort of stuff. And then ultimately what came out of that is people started to think about this concept of a group of people born around the same time. Like, forever, we've always talked about young people. Like, you can go read any of the ancient Greek or whatever stuff, like, oh, these young people are terrible, right? We've always said that. But that tends to be more life stage and not generational. And so what we're really interested in are these generational cohorts. And so ultimately what happened is people, probably the mid 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, you started seeing a lot of conversation around generations. And usually it was tied after events, right? Maybe after World War I, World War II, different things that sort of group people through a unifying experience that then they became more similar in certain ways, right? Baby boomers were a result of all these people coming back from the war. Many times they didn't have jobs. They had skills that were misaligned with what was going on, and they wanted to go make babies. And so we had this massive baby boom, which, by the way, Gen Z and millennials don't know that baby boomers were actually named for a baby boom.
Oh, really?
That's pretty funny, right?
Yeah,
like,
it
y'all
is.
like, of
Yeah,
course,
I just
baby
take it for
boomers, yeah.
granted. Yeah.
Yeah, like everybody knows what that is. No, that's totally a generational assignment of the name. So you started having this conversation, and a bunch of people sort of pioneered the space and talked about like who you are is where you were when, and a lot of themes around that. And where it got off track is people started to use generations to divide us. It's happened a lot during the 60s and the 70s. You can even see some of there's my Life magazine, this side right there.
Oh, there
It
you
says
are.
the generation gap, right? And that is from 1966. And if you look really closely at that cover of that Life magazine, it's an older guy and a younger guy yelling at each other. And the younger person has long hair, and the older guy is like, "What's wrong with these young people?" This is not a new conversation.
Right.
All right.
Right.
But what then became this sort of common accepted definition is a generations every 20 years, which is total garbage. Like, it's completely made up, but everybody likes it because we like round numbers. We're like, oh, 20 years, that makes sense. Like, it doesn't mean anything. So what we try to look at CGK is what we call predictability by scenario, which is, when does a group of people born about the same time, raised in about the same place, start to behave differently than the group before or after them? And so you don't actually know, for example, like, we don't know when a generation starts and stops until enough time has passed where you can look back and go, oh, look, it stopped back there. We had something that happened. So, for example, an easy one, in the US, 9/11 was a defining event for millennials, people like me. That was our, like, where were you at that period of time? Who were you with? How did you feel? All of those things. Typically, you create fear of the unknown, and it challenges your beliefs or your views of the future, right? You're like, oh my gosh, the future, like, I don't know what's going to happen. That's what causes us to stop in our tracks. And it looks different in different places around the world, right? 9/11 in other parts of the world means something totally different. Want to go speak there, it's a totally different experience, or no experience, like Brexit and other places, tsunamis, wars, we could talk about all that. But the idea is that if you took 9/11, which happened in 2001, what people historically would do, including a bunch of big famous research firms, is they would say, well, the generation ended in 2001. That's total nonsense, because you have to be old enough to remember the experience, to create fear of the unknown, to contextualize it in some way, and to assign a value to it. So you actually have to back up, right? So, like, we were the ones who came out and said millennials actually end around 1996. Because if you're born after that, you probably don't remember 9/11. It wasn't a shared experience. You assign no cultural or other values to it. It's like you just don't remember it, right? And so the generation would end before the date of the actual experience. So sometimes you have really clear events that happen. We call them generation defining moments. And you're like, oh, this happened, and we're going to back up, and we're going to know when this mattered. Challenger explosion in the US, many of y'all know the Challenger tragedy. It skews younger than normal because there was a teacher on board. Because there was a teacher on board, they showed it during school when the tragedy happened. If a teacher hadn't been on board, it wouldn't have impacted kids so young, because it would have made the evening news. Does that make sense? And so all these sorts of things play into it. So when we look at this predictability by scenario, you start to get these broader trends. Our whole belief is, and this is what I talk about all the time in my speeches, is that generations are clues and not a box. Everybody wants to put us in boxes based on our birth year, and it never works. But what they are is they're clues that, if we understand the clues through research and data, they help us to better connect and build trust and have influence. They give us a head start. And that's the end of it. Like, there's no, oh, you're born in 72, you're all these things, right? And so if we can begin to process it that way, then you see them as clues and not a box. Then we start to look at what unifies them. And ironically, or interestingly for y'all, the top unifier is geography.
Geography.
So so if I speak outside the US and you want to talk about generations, they can be vastly different than a generation in the US. But people don't ever talk about that. They're like, oh, we're just going to pick up this construct and drop it somewhere else. And it doesn't work. You know, like, Christian, you're in Italy, very different event shaped Italy, right? At the same time, totally different relationship with government and politics in Italy, right? Lots going
Jason,
on there, totally different history.
Just like here in the US, the generations are, at least in my mind, the boomer, then the Generation X that followed, which was a smaller generation, then the Generation Y, which is the millennials. That's you. Chris and Marisa, are you millennial? What would you characterize yourself as? Xers or?
I'm an Xer.
You're an Xer. And Marisa, are you an Xer?
Yeah.
You're an Xer.
Yeah.
And then we have Generation Z. And then I guess now we got Generation Alpha. that's starting to develop. At least that's kind of in my mind the way. Is that kind of how you think about generations here in the U.S.? Is that roughly
Yes.
right?
So roughly. So we actually think baby boomers are two generations, not one. They've just been
Oh,
misgrouped
okay.
because older boomers and younger boomers had very different formative events.
Totally agree with that. Totally
You know,
agree.
and
So am I
when
an
I speak,
older or a younger boomer? Just looking at
I
me, what
don't
do you think, Jason?
I don't know because I see
And
you in
remember, he
khaki
doesn't
pants.
own a pair of jeans, so take
Yeah,
that into
yeah, he's strongly unique.
I'm my own generation.
You
There
are.
you go.
There you
Yeah,
go.
totally true.
There you go.
Yeah. And so, but that's sort of the way you just responded to that is how
Yeah.
roomfuls of executives respond. Because for the last 50 years, they've been told they're one generation. And you're like, no,
Yeah.
you're talking about a group that was more 50s or 60s kids versus 70s. Very different experiences like technology, parenting style, what was going on in the world and so forth.
Right.
So yeah, so you have boomers, like you said, Gen X, which you referred to, our Gen Xers on here. Gen X are the most questioning and skeptical.
Oh, is
They
that
always
right?
ask the most questions. Oh yeah, for sure.
Ah,
Yeah, they
that's
really
definitely
are the
Marisa.
trust
She
but verify.
definitely, she's very questioning. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, she's had to bite her tongue like 4 times. She's wanted to ask a question.
Yeah.
So while Gen X appears shorter when most people
Yeah.
share these the birth years, it's actually not true because if you think about boomers really being two generations, not one, it's a little bit more similar to Gen X. And then for millennials, which are Gen Y, and then they switch the name, same generation, we think millennials are going to break apart as well. We're definitely starting to see that. But what we always try to separate is life stage from generation, right? Because everybody thinks that you're like, oh, if you're 25, you're a millennial. No, there's no millennials who are 25 anymore.
Right.
Like or 40 something, right? That's a whole huge generation. So you have that, and then Gen Z, like you said, I predict, which is unfortunate because my book is called Economy over there. Gen Z, their name will be changed eventually because it was Gen Z was a filler name, just like Gen Y. It was a continuation of Gen X. Like it's sort of a lazy name. And then Gen Alpha, which is this emerging generation, we don't know what their name will ultimately be, but
Right.
what we've been studying is that they will not remember COVID. So we know for a fact that the COVID experience is not a part of their experience. So like done deal, they don't remember it. What we don't know is when Gen Z ends and Gen Alpha or whatever you want to call them begins because they're too young to do our type of studies because we have to have parental consent and you have to watch them and all this sort of stuff. We also don't know if Gen Z is going to break apart as well because older Gen Zers had a very different COVID experience than younger Gen Zers. If you think about that, right? You were maybe in college or starting out in the world and all of a sudden everything turns upside down. Maybe you go back in with your parents, you suddenly have remote work, which all of a sudden is normal for your career trajectory and like a whole nother conversation. Like all of these things happen. Government sends you money. Like this is all new and it's all they know. Where the younger part of the same generation had a very different experience, right? My daughter's 13 and during COVID, she suddenly went to remote school. She at the time went to a Spanish school. So she's doing fully remote school in Spanish over Zoom at home. That's a very different experience than somebody who was much older and had, a friend group or other things. Texas had a very different experience than, for example, New York. Like all of these things play into that. So yes, that's a sequence of the generations. The birth years will vary, by the way, around the world because it's not exactly the same. And so you have to always be careful. Like when I speak a lot outside the US, you want to try to make it as appropriate as you can for the geography that's represented.
Can I ask, do people in the rest of the world think about generations the same way we do? I understand what you're saying is that the generations are different because their experiences are different. But do they think about the world in terms of generations? Well, like it feels like here in the US, we think about when we talk about demographics, we think about generations. Like kind of is the natural way we kind of frame the conversation in the way we think. Is that the way the rest of the world thinks about things as well?
Not in the way that we do in the States.
Okay.
So for example, in other parts of the world, they have different relationships with people that are elders, for example. So, if you have a different relationship with how you think about people aging, like historically, maybe they moved in with you when they got older versus what we do here in the US, like that sort of changes the idea. You always have a pretty consistent older versus younger conversation because that does play out pretty much everywhere and in all the ways you can think of. Where we see the most conversation is around Gen Z and millennials. And the reason is they are the trend drivers. And so people like to talk about them. They also tend to be more different than previous generations, and people want to talk about that and they want to understand that. So I do a ton of work outside the US, but they really want to hear about millennials and Gen Z and what are the trends that they're bringing and how do we think about them, more so than understanding boomers, who they tend to be in the room, or Gen X, right? They're like, we got us. What about this other group? So those are really hot conversations outside the US. We do a ton of work and studies outside the US too.
Okay, so coming back to the US, I'd like to talk a little bit about each generation. And maybe the way to do this is, what is your favorite generation? I mean, I don't know if that's a fair question, but that's most interesting, that's just a little weird or a little off, or you can define it the way you want to define it. But what generation do you find the most interesting, the most that you like the most to focus on?
Yeah, we try not to pick any one I'm going to answer your question. What happens a lot of times is people only want me to talk about one generation, like just talk about Gen Z, right? But that generation, if they're watching, feels picked on, and everybody else is going, what about me?
Okay.
And what we're actually trying to create is generational context, which is how are they similar and different, so we can build bridges. But the one I like to study the most is Gen Z. And that's because they're very different than advertised. And I love that. Like we're constantly shocked by our findings. And you're like, wow, this is amazing, because you think you know something, and then you do the research. I'm sure all of y'all, this is your space. And you're like, wow, I had no idea that that's true. And then it just leads to all these other things. So I'll give you one that's like a hot potato, for example, because I know y'all like data here. In our study, we do a State of Gen Z study every year. In our last study we did, we found that 70% of Generation Z, right? So they're all the way up into like 26, 27-ish. 70% of Gen Z believes in universal basic income.
Say that again. How many? What percent?
70.
Oh, wow. That is interesting. Yeah.
And I'm watching all three of your faces. It's so fascinating because all of us go, well, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
Yeah.
And how do I feel about that? And what does that mean in my own family? And, how does this impact retirement?
Oh,
and
just
think?
For folks out there, universal basic income is the government provides a certain level of income regardless of anything. It doesn't, you just get this income and you can use it however you want to use it. And everyone gets it. Everyone gets it.
Yeah, basic living wage provided by the government to pretty much everybody that's over adult and then adult age. Yeah, and it's wild. We've been doing this for years, and that number keeps going up, and it jumped up dramatically after COVID, because what happened during COVID?
Right.
The government sent stimulus payment.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Right, Marisa? And so now all of a sudden something nobody thought was possible is suddenly what? Possible. And you can't put the genie back in the bottle. But when I share that stat as an example, like half of a room is like, we are totally in trouble. The world is ending.
Well,
and the other half is like, finally they got it. Like,
speaking as a boomer, though, I'll have to tell you, my mind has changed. I think my mind is changing on this. I was of the traditional view. Really, you want to do what exactly? I mean, aren't people just going to stop working? I mean, what's going to happen to the world? And now I'm going, oh, well, maybe that makes some sense. Because there are some experiments around the country. We actually had a nice conversation with someone who is operating universal basic income program in Denver, and the results are really quite interesting. I mean, it really things are turning out much better than I would have anticipated. It's giving people options and choices, and making their lives better and everyone else's lives better. So, speaking as a boomer, or maybe I'm that weird boomer again, my mind is changing on this one.
Yeah, well, in our studies, because they're cross-generation, the older you are, the less you support it. Like, it's really clear.
Okay.
And I just share that because we don't have to assign a value to it. To me, it's not is it good or bad. Like, that's everybody else's personal choice.
Yeah.
But if I bring that and people go, okay, and then we talk about the fact that Gen Z doesn't believe they'll ever be able to afford to retire. Okay, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So now if you don't think you'll be able to afford to retire, and in our studies, what we see is Gen Z doesn't believe Social Security will exist, not in any meaningful way. So now all of a sudden, and this is how we help leaders think about this, you have a generation that's, 25 years old, and they think that they're going to have to work forever. The government is not going to be able to support them. They're probably going to have to end up supporting their own parents, and they're already starting to figure this out because they're seeing these things play out. And so then you go to them. This happens to me at events all the time. So they'll come to me like, Jason, I know you are all positive about Gen Z, but they're just lazy. And I'm like, well, okay, maybe. Why do you think they're lazy? And I'm like, well, we offer unlimited paid overtime, as much paid overtime as you want, and they never take it. And I'm like, okay, well, are you open to another perspective? You don't have to agree with it, like it, or anything. And they're like, and I'm like, okay, well, if you're 25 years old.
That sounds like Cris, by the way. Do you want to do that again? Cris, this sounds like you. Yeah, there you go. That's definitely Cris. Yeah.
Really?
But if you're 25 years old and you think you're going to work for the next 70 years, you truly believe this.
Yeah.
Do you want to work on Saturdays? Do you want to work overtime at night? No. There's tons of behavioral reasons. It's not that they're lazy. They're going, I got to work for 70 more years. Why be in a rush?
Are you sure about that, Jason, though? Are you sure that's the way they're thinking?
Well, in our studies, they consistently tell us that work-life balance is dramatically more important to them. Yeah. That they don't think they should be in a hurry, that they're going to be working forever, right? All of these things. And if you start to add it together, it's not a huge leap to go, well, there are probably good reasons behind the choices they're making, which is really what we're trying to get people to see. We're not saying it's the right choice.
It's not that they're lazy. You're just saying they've got a different worldview because they've got different circumstances, at least in their thinking about how things are going to play out. They've got a different worldview. Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to get people to see. It's like, we don't need people to agree with each other. Like, that's not our goal. We're not trying to create consensus. But if I can get somebody to go, oh, there are real reasons behind their thinking, it's not just that they're lazy, then maybe we can have a better conversation and get to know what they really want, or figure out some other way to shift recruitment. So I'll give you an example. We have to solve workforce problems for companies all the time, right? Everybody thinks all these jobs are hybrid in the world or remote. The majority of the jobs in the US are still not hybrid or remote. You got to show up and do stuff. And if you're a manufacturer, you got to show up every day. And so we have to solve the problem of how do you recruit and retain people that maybe you don't think about work the same way you do. And so, for example, one of the solutions we found with our clients is if you can shift your start or stop hours by 1 hour. So if you let people show up, let's pretend it was 8 to 5, just for simple, and you let them show up at 9 and stay to 6, or show up at 7 and leave at 4, you can drive really significant recruiting and retention outcomes without having to pay people more money. And so all of a sudden the manufacturers go, oh, it's not that they're lazy. They're trying to fit this into their lifestyle. And if we can just be flexible a little bit, we can achieve our goals and they can achieve their goals. And all of a sudden now you got people rolling this out and it's really working. Those are the sort of solutions we can ultimately get to if we don't start from the place of, well, they're just lazy. Right? But it takes a while to get people to, understand that. And once they do, it's like the whole world changes. It's amazing.
So Gen Z is the generation you like the most interesting to.
I think they're the least understood just because of their age, and they're still forming a lot of their beliefs and opinions. I mean, if you think about it, they've entered the workforce later than any previous generation that we've studied.
Right.
They are getting their driver's license if they're getting it later than ever before. Like, we could go through this whole long list of things that are dramatically different, including their communications profile. So yeah, they're causing all kinds of challenges, and we see them as opportunities. So that's really interesting. The generation we most focus on retaining for clients is actually Gen X. Because Marisa and Cris, like, their Gen X in our research is deciding over the next 3 years, do they stay where they are and finish out their career, or do they go somewhere else? Well, all of a sudden, Gen X becomes the most important generation to retain, not Gen Z or Millennials. And so now we've got to work with these companies to go, okay, well, what's your Gen X retention strategy? And we may not call it that, but just this idea of people that are in these roles are being poached and they're deciding, do they make one more move or not? And they have the experience, they have the relationships, they have all of these things. So they're really sought after. But if we focus all our attention on Gen Z, we actually miss the people with experience that we need to keep. Right? And so that's why the conversation becomes very layered and, for me, really fun.
So Gen Z, are they the generation defined by 9/11? That's kind of the event.
They don't remember 9/11, which was our big discovery. Yeah, they're the generation after 9/11.
What was that? What were the birth years, Jason? Just to level set.
Yeah. So it's sort of, everybody has their own birth years that they use. So that's even a hot topic, like who names what generation, all of these sorts of things. So we think of them as clues and not a box. They're a guide. And if you're born around any of the birth years, usually within 2 or 3 years, you're a cusper anyway. which is a huge advantage because it makes you empathetic to both. You're a natural bridge. And in our work, you're more likely to be in a leadership role because customers tend to move up because they've had to be a bridge. It's really fascinating. Like I spoke, at 2 different events this week, and we had, all the customers in the room raised their hands, and it was way more than you should statistically have because they've naturally had to be a bridge, which is really fascinating. So for Gen Z, for example, we usually start around like 1996, 1997 as the oldest, the beginning birth years. We're not exactly sure when Gen Z ends because of all the things I talked about, they're minors. So there's only so much research that you can do to really see their behavioral differences. But we know there's a generation board after them. So if we had to guess, it might be like 2012-ish, might be the end of them, something like that, but somewhere in that range. Millennials are a huge generation. We were born anywhere from like 1980-ish, slightly before that to slightly after, depending on who you ask, up to about 1995, 96. Massive generation, 80-ish million in the United States. Everybody thinks we're not working. We're the largest generation in the workforce.
And that's the generation that's the generation
Yeah.
that's influenced by 9/11, I guess. That would be the one.
You got it.
Yeah. Okay. So what's Generation Z? What's the event that kind of defines Generation Z or events? Is there one?
COVID. Yeah.
Oh,
COVID.
COVID.
Oh.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it wasn't an event. This is the thing where you really get into the weeds in our work. 9/11 was an event.
Yeah.
Right. It was something that happened. And then, depending on where you were connected to it in different ways. COVID in our work is really important because it was a true global event. And it wasn't just a day or a week or a month, right? I was doing virtual events all around the world for that whole period of time. And we would have Gen Zers on one of the events for one of the big companies you would know. So we would have them from Singapore. We would have them from all across the Middle East. We'd have them all these different places. And in many ways, they were having some of the same experiences. Now, did it vary? Sure. But a lot of what they were feeling and sharing with us was very similar. So it's a true global event in ways that we've not had global events, which is really wild. And so it became very unifying in terms of a generational identity. Right or wrong, doesn't matter. Just it's something that they experienced. And because it happened over such a long period of time, it created all kinds of side effects and outcomes that we're still dealing with. Massive mental health issues being one of the most important that's not talked about enough. Right? There's so much there that this generation went through all around the world. So Gen Z, interestingly, in our work, continues to be the most consistent generation in the world. So whenever we do these global studies for all these big brands, Gen Z is more similar than any other generation. Due to cheap mobile technology, social media, and COVID, they tend to be much more similar. The older you go, the more they're like from different planets. Like boomers in different parts of the world are like all over the place.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, so because of COVID, COVID was since COVID was such a global event and everyone had the shared experience, that defined that generation, and it's very consistent across the globe.
It was a consistent influence, yeah.
Yeah,
and
wow.
consistency and being the same are different, right?
Yeah,
they're not the same everywhere, but they had this one big shared experience. So what happened was, and I'm always careful about the word shared. They went through an experience at the same time. Their experience could still be very different, but a lot of the emotions and things that they felt, their parents not knowing how to help them, which was a big theme, being 1, 2, 3 people away from somebody who died. All of these hit at a really critical life stage in terms of their maturation and had this huge impact all around the world. So when I talk about in different places, like people really respond to it, particularly Gen Z, because this was such a formative experience that they went through. But if you look back and you try to name one, y'all are all economists. Like, what's the last time that there was an event or experience that people went through all around the same time, all around the world, across socioeconomics? Yeah. Right. Across all of these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Okay. So that's Generation Z. It talked a little bit about the millennials. What's the kind of defining event for Generation X? What would define Generation X?
Also hotly debated. So when we look at Gen X, right, remember you talked about that they were sort of these shorter birth years, right? We look at their, depending on how you look at it, tends to be around 1965-ish to anywhere from, 76 to 78-ish. That's sort of the group that they have there. This is where like the Challenger explosion, like we think the Challenger explosion was very big deal for Gen X. You can also see, in the US, oil embargoes, I'm not a crook, like all sorts of stuff that you can sort of talk about. Big ones for us in our work, though, are things like, this is kind of interesting. Most people don't guess this. Women entering the workforce, massive impact on Gen X. Divorce rate through the roof, massive impact on Gen X. What do you end up with? latchkey kids. What are latchkey kids really, really good at? Being self-reliant and skeptical, right? I mean, these are like, and so if you start to, you're like, oh, I mean, even things which is funny, like the microwave had a huge impact on, and nobody talks about it, right? It's so funny, but like, yeah.
What do you mean? How so?
Oh, the microwave was a big deal. People were able to go home and make their own food and not have their mom cook it for them. That was a big deal. It was made quickly, which was a big deal. Latchkey kids could do it. Microwaves were expensive. If you bought a house, microwave didn't convey with it initially. Like, these are big things that like we overlook because they're not big to us. If I talk about the microwave, because I talk about technology a lot, younger people are like dying laughing, like, who cares? It's a freaking microwave, right? And I'm like, no, this was a breakthrough.
Yeah. Yeah.
All generational context.
So Marisa and Cris are your Xers. Does that resonate with you? Is there like it does?
It does to me. Yeah. I mean, the microwave and the latchkey kid thing goes hand in hand. I could heat up Hot Pockets every day when I got home from school, and I was alone babysitting like a 7-year-old when I was 10. Yeah. Yeah. That my mom going back to work and us being alone every day for a few hours, it was definitely like a defining part of my childhood.
Interesting.
And the space shuttle Challenger, I remember everything about that experience in that day. I remember them wheeling a television into the classroom for us to all watch it. And I think I was in second grade when second or something like that. Yeah. But certainly
Gen X. Gen X also was sort of in the eye of the AIDS epidemic. I mean, there's so many things that happened during that period of time.
Right.
And that's where it's interesting. You sort of dive into like late 70s, early to mid 80s, and you come up with all kinds of things. And people attach that to millennials, but you gotta remember, millennials are too. Like, this is like, and that's why we always have to sort of think about what was the formative age when they were going through this. I mean, in some places we'll talk about hip hop, like all of these things are important. And that's why it's clues and not a box. And geography has a massive role. So even in the US, you see trends earlier in urban areas. And so they would take longer to ripple out. Same thing if you're affluent, you would see trends sooner. There's all kinds of interesting stuff around that. And Gen X is sort of caught between these two big generations. So they're never talked about. They're always overlooked, right? Their theme is trust but verify. They always want to see my data. Like, I mean, I love them. Like, it's amazing. So that sort of stuff is just really fun for what we do. Yeah.
Of course, you that doesn't resonate with you though, huh?
I hesitate to speak though, because I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of the whole attribute. I'm not skeptical of the whole generational construct, but and I certainly remember the challenge. I remember I was in health class and the TV being wheeled in and watching the launch, and then all of a sudden, the horror. But I think it's more, I would identify perhaps more on the different technologies, like the Walkman, right? That's a big deal. Totally. Or Star Wars coming out, or so PCs, computers, right? So I would identify more with those, but I don't know. I am a bit skeptical of the whole generational construct here. To your point, and you make all the points about it varies so much by geography. So how can we really say these cohorts are similar? So, but again, the more I speak, the more I emphasize my Generation Xness with my prove the point.
The irony.
The irony.
Yeah, it's funny because when I talk about Gen X, like we spend most of the time talking about their healthy skepticism. And like some people take it as cynicism, and that's applying a judgment to it. Like, and what's interesting is Gen X is the most loyal generation, which is really fascinating because once they buy into something and believe it, they're by far the most loyal, which is really wild. They'll follow bosses, different places they go, but they get a boss they don't like, then they're going to go to another place. It's really fascinating. There's a lot there that we could dig into, but Gen X is really important, and we think people don't talk about them enough. I actually spoke at an event not long ago, and people change. Title of my talk is "Crossing the Generational Divide," right? And it's all these hidden insights and data and it's stories, and it's like hilarious, right? It's really funny. And then we share a bunch of strategies that we've tested that work across the industry or the situation we're trying to solve for them. But this one client, they changed the name of my talk, which happens all the time, right? And they said, a conversation, about generations. Gen Z, millennials, and boomers, getting to the heart of it. I'm like, again, they left out Gen X right out of the title. I mean, it was so funny. Like, they just never get talked about. And they're actually the glue in the workforce, which is really fun. So most skeptical of the generation conversation, by the way.
Cris, is there anything else you wanted to say about why you're skeptical about this whole generational concept, or should we just move on?
we can move on. I mean, even
Yeah.
just the birth years, for example, there are different definitions, right? And
Okay.
it seems to me, forgive me, it seems a bit like a horoscope, right? You can kind of see yourself in any definition that you give me. I can see those positive attributes of a Gen X, but if you hid the name and described Gen Z, I'd probably see positive attributes of myself in that same description, right? So I don't know.
Well, and you're right on, Chris, that everybody's a mix of these, right? And the way I view them is clues and not a box. We've lived 140 studies now, a massive consistency in terms of the answers. We can even predict what a lot of them are based on the generation. So at one level, they're pretty highly predictive. And then at another level, we're all still people. We're all still unique. We also have the experiences we have in the world. And I always believe, and this is what we teach leaders, is like, this is one of many lenses to understand people better. And if we just add that to every other thing that you're learning about others,
Sure.
It's just another way to be hopefully a little more empathetic and understanding and remove the us versus them, which is how a lot of these conversations become. And we really want to make it positive and constructive and like, how do we bring people together? Because for our clients who are trying to grow their business, right, they're solving a workforce problem or a sales problem, like they need to have better understanding to drive deeper connection in whatever that situation is. And so if we can make it a little bit better for like you to be skeptical and me to go, it's fine. Christian's skeptical. Of course he's skeptical. He want to go download the studies and see what they say. Like, it's totally fine. Like, to not take that person, like, this is amazing. We can have a deeper conversation. But we'll have, for example, millennials we work with, and they'll be like, oh, Christian started questioning me, like he doesn't like me. And so we have to teach millennials, no, it's not that Christian doesn't like you. It's that he doesn't believe you. And if you know that, then you will know how to work really well with him. And that's what we teach. And this happens every day.
That's better. That's better.
That's better.
That's better.
Yeah.
That's got nothing to do with
He
when he was
loves you,
born.
but he doesn't believe you. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is totally workable. I mean,
That's workable.
It's funny,
Yes.
but it's totally true. So that's why I love this stuff.
Right.
Yeah, it's fun.
All right, I want to come back and talk about the boomers. Personally, my favorite generation. Just saying. But before we do that, let's play the stats game, because that could be a lot of fun in the context of this conversation. And that is, we each put forward a statistic. The rest of the group tries to figure that out with clues, questions, deductive reasoning. We want a stat that's not so hard that we'll never get it. One that's not so easy, we get it right away. And if it's apropos to the topic at hand, that would be great. I've got a really good stat, but I generally go last, so I'll stick to that. Maybe we'll go with the tradition is to have Marisa go first. Marisa, you want to go first?
Sure. And it's not germane to the conversation, so apologies on that.
It's not germane to the conversation.
No.
All right, you're not going first then.
All right.
No, go ahead. Fire
Okay.
away.
It's an economic indicator that came out last week. I was trying to look for something age related, but I kind of gave up.
Okay, go ahead.
So minus 0.5% in May.
And this was
leading economic indicators.
Yep, there you go.
Oh, and you're on vacation.
There you go.
Holy
macaroni.
Why? Okay, so explain why'd you pick that?
This is the Conference Board's index of leading economic indicators. We look at this every month. It has 10 different economic indicators in it, and it tries to, historically, it's been pretty good at predicting a recession when this has been deeply negative for a period of time. It's been in negative territory for about 2 years, right? And it fell again in May. And it's actually, we got a listener question about this specific piece of data recently, which is why I picked it, because I thought we could talk about it a little bit. It's touted as having a really good predictive power on recessions. It's been basically predicting a recession though for quite a long time, and we haven't had that. Some of the things that go into it are other things that typically predict recessions, like the yield curve is one of the indicators that is part of this leading indicator, right? Consumer confidence is in this as well and has been dragging this lower. And we've talked a lot about consumer confidence and how it's at odds with the economic data. So it's
so what minus 0.5, that sounds pretty negative.
Yeah, it's just,
read anything
it's,
into it, or it's been wrong for 2 years. It's just still wrong.
exactly. It's been negative every single month. It has fallen for 2 years, right? And so at what point do you say this is no longer predicting a recession?
I said that a year ago. It's no longer. I said 2 years ago.
But there are many people that say, well, it just hasn't happened yet. It can't predict the timing of a recession.
Well, there will be a recession at some point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So at what point is it just lapping itself, right? Yeah, I mean, so the person who asked this question of us pointed to it and said, many economists look at this and say that it's never been wrong. Is this yet another economic indicator that's wrong in predicting a recession? And I would say, it's probably time to give it up on that, right? And like I said, the yield curve is one of the indicators that is in this. That is also not.
Is the University of Michigan survey in there too? I think it is, isn't it? This consumer sentiment from the University of Michigan.
Well, the Conference Board's consumer confidence survey is in it. I
Oh,
don't
it
know.
is. Oh, that's right. It's the Conference Board. You're right.
Because
It
it's
would be
the
the
Conference Board.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
So I doubt Michigan is in it.
No, probably not. Probably
yeah.
not. Yeah. No, I would expect not. Yeah. Yeah, I guess my thought was that most recessions are led by the declines in interest rate sensitive manufacturing and construction sectors, right? And this go around, those two sectors of the economy have held up admirably well for lots of idiosyncratic reasons. So they've gone flat essentially. But they're not declining. Therefore, the leading indicators just aren't as useful because they're really focused on those two sectors, and those two sectors have not led the way down.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's very focused on the manufacturing sector and not so much on services.
Right.
And it's got all these financial metrics in it. That's right. Yeah. So it could be overweighting how manufacturing and goods producers are doing.
But that was pretty impressive, Cris. Holy cow. And you're on vacation. You just like, boom. Yeah, I was getting settled in to ask a bunch of questions and you nailed it right away. That's
I'm waiting for that recession.
Yeah. So Jason, do you see how this is done? Do you want to play?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to do one more with Cris and then we'll come to you?
Yeah, sure.
Let's do one with Cris. Cris,
mine's not particular. It's more germane to me. It's all about me.
Oh, it's all about you. That's an Xer thing, isn't it?
How very Gen X of you.
It's all about me. Me.
So if you want it, I'll give it to you. But otherwise, you can move on.
All right, go ahead, fire away.
You want it? Okay, let's see.
I want it, definitely.
This will be impressive. Two numbers: 5% and 33%.
And
I kind of alluded to it at the top of the hour.
Oh boy, I don't remember the top of the hour at all. I can barely remember 5 minutes ago. Does it have
something to do with Italian tourism?
Yes.
Oh,
well, not
currency.
Not just Italian tourism, but European tourism.
Oh, what are the two numbers again?
5% and 33%.
5% is it? And you're saying it's related to tourism?
Yes. European tourism.
Is it the makeup of tourists? Is it?
You're so close.
What?
I'm going to give it to you. You're so close. 5%.
U.S. tourists are up 33%. Overall tourists 5%.
No.
Okay.
They're both shares. If you want to keep going.
Is it Americans and
Japanese
Chinese tourists?
Nope. Let me just give it to you.
Give it to us.
Really low. 5% is the population, the share of the global population in the EU, in the European Union.
Okay.
And 33% is the share of international tourist dollars in the European Union. So just to show how the displacement here. So $500 trillion of $500 billion of tourist dollars are spent in the EU every year.
So 33% of tourist dollars are spent in the EU.
Correct. All international tourism.
Yep.
The EU gets a third, even though it only has 5% of the population.
So that is all about me. Me.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Jason, you want to go next?
All right, I'll give it a shot. I've changed mine since I got to hear y'all's too. So the number's 45%. And do y'all guess now? How does it work? Or should I give you
yeah.
Okay.
Now, is it related to generational? dynamics?
It's related to generations, money, and food.
Generations, money, and food. 45%. So it's a share of something. No.
No,
Is it
not a
is it a growth rate? Is it a growth rate?
It's a percentage that have done or not done something in the last 3 months.
Oh, eating out in a restaurant?
Now you're getting closer. Yeah.
You know what I
Getting closer.
read? I'm just going to throw it out there that 45% of people have worked in jobs where they got tips.
Oh,
did you? I
that's
think
a
it's
good one.
actually 43% maybe,
Mhm.
but that's not what you had in mind.
No, but we're circling it.
Oh,
Should I
we are?
just
You're
share?
saying
So-
ever worked in a job,
Ever worked at
Yeah.
a job where you got a tip.
at a job where they've gotten a tip? 43% of Americans.
This is
and
not
that's-
a workforce
kidding.
stat or work-related stat.
That's in the context of President Trump,
Yeah.
former President Trump proposing not taxing tips. That's
Mhm.
where I learned that stat. But that's so 45% of Americans, it says generational and money. 45%.
It's Gen Z, so I'll make it even more specific.
Okay, 45%.
I have the
Gen
other
Z,
generations here too, but yeah.
Have not cooked at home in the last 3 months or
Oh,
something
that's
like
a good guess. I like that.
Use a
Like that.
microwave on a daily basis.
Played.
No?
You want to, I use the microwave continually all day long. When I have a cup of coffee, it has to be the same temperature. So every time it comes down a degree, I stick it into the microwave. So all morning long, I'm doing the the microwave, doing the microwave.
That's a solved problem. They have these wonderful electric
I know.
thermoses that
I know.
on your phone you can actually
but
set
I
the
li-
temperature and it'll stay there all
See,
day.
But Jason, I like this certain mug. I have to have this mug.
I
That's
have
my
mine right
problem. That's my problem. There you go.
here.
So if you can
That's definitely
solve that
boomer
problem-
behavior.
That's boomer behavior.
microwaving something over and over again for hours on
Yeah.
end.
Yeah, that is not happening over here. We have the electric mug. the button.
45% of Gen Zs have
Something
something
in the last
regarding
3 months.
saving, some savings.
All right, I'm gonna tell y'all because
Okay.
is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was trying to find an economic one that would be interesting for y'all and generational and relevant to our conversation today. So in this new study that we have, it hasn't yet been released. 45% of Gen Z in the last 3 months have skipped at least one meal because they needed to save money.
Oh, wow.
Which was 9 points higher than the other generations on average.
Oh my gosh.
So
That is something.
yeah, I'm looking at the
Really?
chart right now. It's pretty wild.
Wow, that's scary, actually.
Well, there's a lot going on but yeah, and it's dramatically different than the other one. So way outside the margin of error.
45% of Gen Z respondents say they have skipped a meal in the past 3 months to save money.
And these are, by the way, these are only employed Gen Z.
Employed.
Yeah, part-time or full-time.
Wow. So that shows how stressed these
stressed they are.
folks are.
Yeah, that's what this whole study was looking at around employed generation, the employed workforce today in the U.S. and how they're thinking about payday and making money last till then and how they're spending their money and so forth. So I thought that was sort of like a wow, interesting stat that we could all interpret differently and have a whole nother hour conversation on.
You're saying that's you said something like 9 percentage points more than any other generation. Is that what you said? Okay.
Yeah.
I guess that makes some sense, right? Because they're younger. Huh. Wow.
It's all,
Boy,
all how you want to think about it.
Have you, do you have a time series of that? Do you know how that's changed over time? No.
Yes, and that one, I don't have the follow-up to it, but I know it's grown since the last time we did this, which was 2 years ago. I know it's increased. I just don't have that slide next here on that I can look at. But yeah, it has gone up because in this study that we led with this really fascinating company, all of the financial pressures increased since we asked the same benchmark questions in 2022. So
fascinating. All right, I got a stat. It's apropos, like it should be apropos to the topic at hand. I'm just saying, 1.62, and it is demographic.
Is that the dependency ratio?
Not the dependency ratio.
No.
Replacement rate.
Ratio?
It's the replacement rate's 2.1, right? So what's 1.62? The replacement ratio is the kind of the fertility rate where at which
Oh, so yeah,
was-
you're saying that's the birth rate, right?
that's birth rate, 1.62 in 2023, 1.62, lowest
That's
on,
what I meant.
yeah, lowest on record. Lowest on, oh yeah, so you got it, Jason, you got it. Yeah. Lowest on record in 2023. And
In the US or globally?
this is US. And a lot of debate as to what's going on, but one thing that I found, one explanation that I found very interesting in the context of the conversation is that people of that age, I guess this is now, would this be now Generation Z? Wouldn't it be, that are in kind of in their 20s at this point? They're very worried about the future and what that holds, and therefore much more reluctant to have children, which I find interesting.
Yeah.
Does that resonate?
Yes, but yes, and the trick with the birth rates, particularly when we look at the average age where people have their first child, which is split by gender, male and female, so we look at in the US, the age at which you become a parent for the first time, all of those numbers have been increasing, so they're going up. And if you look at it sort of on a weighting basis, a lot of that is due to millennials, not Gen Z. So the millennials have delayed kids, they've delayed marriage, they've delayed all this stuff. And what we're waiting to see is, and we're starting to see this, so this is what we're really interested in, the 36 to 44 age group and their rate of having kids now. So we're ending up with a lot of older parents because what the millennials told us was, I want to have a kid, I'm just not ready yet. And so now they're also crashing into the biological wall of, can they have a kid, right? And so now you have these sort of, I don't like the term geriatric pregnancy, but that's what happened to us in our family with Denise and I. So you have this sort of situation where you have a lot of much older first-time parents even, which is really interesting. So Gen Zs, as you said, delaying it, they have a lot of anxiety about the future, a lot of anxiety in general. But you're also getting pulled up because you're seeing people now start to have kids later who might have traditionally had it earlier. Same with first marriage and buying a house.
Yeah, and that's exactly the other explanation that has been put forward. And also the technology. There's now technology that allows women to have children later, like freezing eggs, for example, has become much more commonplace among millennials, and they're just waiting longer to have their children.
Yeah, and there's tons of good reasons. I mean, right? They had drowning in student loan debt, cost of housing. Many of them have put off some of this relationship
or
things.
Careers. Some of them, people want to have careers, and just get that going, and then have children after they get started.
Tons of reasons. Yep, that's the fun part of this.
Yeah. Okay, let's come back to the boomers. What do you think? What do you say about the boomers, Jason? What's your?
Do you see that? He's so excited. Did y'all see that?
Yeah.
He's like, I'm really calm and patient. Now tell me.
Yeah, now tell me. What do you think? Really? What do you really think?
No, I love boomers. We always say, no, they've got the work experience and life experience. No, for us, when we talk about them a lot, it's just the fact that they have all the money.
They got all the money. That's right.
They got the money, the houses. They're really strange. They actually vote. They know state capitals. I mean, it's amazing. But the way we like to think about boomers is that
I do. I know every capital in the country. I could tell you. Go ahead. Just
I know you can. I'm sure you probably have cash, an emergency check. Like, you're amazing. But
thank you. I that's exactly what I wanted to hear. So thank you.
But where we think the interesting part is that younger generations don't value boomers enough is actually what we find interesting. Like the whole okay boomer and a lot of this sort of thing. Yeah. Because boomers do have the experience, they have the relationships. We work in highly regulated industries. And so in regulated industries, they're really important because of the relationships and the understanding that they have and the experience that they bring. So there's a lot there. I was speaking at this event and this young guy is like, Jason, why you talk about boomers? Like, they're so great. They don't even know technology. And I was like, seriously? They invented the phone you're using.
Good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
But a lot of what the criticism on both sides is really around work style. Like, boomers have a very clear definition of work ethic, but what we try to reposition that as is actually work style, right? It's not work ethic. And so that's one of the things we're frequently trying to bridge with them. They obviously over-index for senior leadership roles because they've been working the most. And now what we see in our work is they're often trying to decide, do they exit the workforce? How long can they stay? Many of them think they're going to have to keep working a lot longer than they thought they would for a variety of reasons. Their identity is more connected to work, we find, than other generations. So if you ask a boomer, for example, where are you from? They tend to tell you the name of their employer. If you ask a Gen Zer, they tend to tell you the place they live.
Yep.
So like that sort of stuff is really helpful, because if you have a group that tends to identify and have a lot of their identity tied to what they do versus another group that tends to have their identity tied to other things outside of work, then you can see where there's sort of this natural conflict that we've got to figure out how to bridge.
That's totally right. Because like I always ask my kids are millennials. I'm a boomer. My kids are millennials, and they're talking about their friend or an acquaintance or something. I go, oh, what do they do? I have no idea what they do. My kids don't know. They don't even ask what they do, right? I find that so bizarre, because that's how at least in my world, that's how we defined ourselves, is what do we do? What do we do? And that's not how they think about it at all, which I find really interesting.
That's Americans and Europeans too, though, right? And so
is that
it's
right?
cultural.
Chris?
Oh yeah.
100%. Yeah, that's
it's not even polite to ask any.
What do you
do
for a living?
Right?
Yeah.
We have to be close friends to get to that point.
Get to that point.
Yeah. Well, and in the European side too, living with your parents longer, like even living with your parents and they're married, like all these on the board of a European company have been for years, like very different views. That's why I always go back to this clues, not a box, and geography is really important, because there's just differences, I mean,
right.
I don't know about you, Mark, but like, what we saw is people, oh, you're boomer, you're 18, you're out of the house. In other places, they're like, no, you're not out of the house. Why would you
still
leave?
A baby.
You don't love me?
Yeah. We're here forever. Yeah. So fascinating. So fast. Anything else maybe connect one last question, because I know we're running short on time here. Try to connect it back to the economy. Is there kind of one thing from your generational prism or perspective that says something about the economy that you find particularly unintuitive, or just something you wouldn't expect?
Yeah. So through that lens, what I find most interesting is in our work with Gen Z, they frequently have emergency accounts, which is highly unusual given how young they are. But they've come up through this period of instability, so they'll have money set aside in one of their accounts, usually digital. It's occasionally cash, but not so much. But they'll have this money set aside for emergency because they just assume things are going to go wrong. And if you look at their savings rate, because y'all are all economists, like people notice the savings rates are decreasing and all this stuff. And so you hear people say all the time, oh, well, this generation doesn't want to save. It's actually not true. They have these emergency accounts, and they've have had them for a long time. I like to joke about like the 17-year-old. They have a birthday party. They get $50. They take the $50, they put it away. Then they go back to you and they say, hey, can I have $50? I want to go buy something. Right. And they really define it as their money versus your money.
Yeah.
And I think that distinction over time could be really interesting to dig more into. So that's one of my favorite.
Well, a really fascinating conversation, very interesting. And I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, it's been an honor to be with you.
You wrote your first book when you were 18, and it sounds like you've written a few more, a couple. How many books have you written?
5.
5 books. Wow. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow. Congratulations.
Is the economy one. Yeah. That's what we're excited about. Those are the different translations. I was on a Zoom the other day and they're like, Jason, you realize one of them is upside down. I was like, well, I don't actually read that language. So thank you for that.
Well, congratulations on all your success. And I can see why you make this subject a very interesting, fascinating, and fun to digest. So thank you for that. And really appreciate you taking the time. Chris, Marisa, anything else before we call it a podcast? Oh, I did want to say, just before we leave, changing the subject a little bit, Jason, I'm actually getting a little nervous about the economy, to tell you the truth. It feels increasingly soft to me. And, the retail sales, the housing starts, the unemployment insurance claims, our tracking estimates for GDP. It looks like growth for the first half of the year is going to be 1.5%-ish. It just feels like things are turning soft. So I'm going to raise my odds of recession. Yes.
Whoa.
Yep. I am. You know, it was at 20%. Now I'm going to put it up over the coming year. I'm going to push it up to 25%. So I think the Fed's waiting too long here, and risks are rising. So I just wanted to throw that out there. You know, get it out there before we call it a podcast.
Your
Yeah.
leading
Can I throw out
economic
one-
indicator is negative.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So I just wanted to say that when I showed up to the event at that CBA, the big event
Yeah.
where I met Mark,
Uh-huh.
y'all should know this because, you know, Chris, you and Marissa might not know this. I saw him and I was like, that's Mark Zane. Mark is here. And I was so excited. And I went up and I was like, I can't believe I'm getting to meet you. Can I sign a book for you? Which just tells you like that, you know, I'm a total dork and I completely own it. And I was so excited to get my picture there with him. So I just want y'all to know people love the work that you do.
You can come on anytime. I really, yeah, geez.
You're
I'll
like,
take
you know
that.
who I am? I'm like, of course I know who you are. So it was really excited. So I wanted to say thank y'all to all three of you to have me on today and the work you do. It's really important and people do pay attention. So thank you for that.
Well, it was a pleasure having you, and hope to have you back.
Yeah, thank you.
And go Boomers. That's all I have to say. And with
enthusiasm.
and with that,
Section 1 or Section 2? We never got to that.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah.
And with that, dear listener, we're going to call this a podcast. We'll talk to you next week. Take care now.